First of all, I'd like to say thanks to Stasis, who co-organized this event with us. We also had support from the McGill GPS Student Engagement Fund and the Rethinking Gramsci 2024 conference. And so I just, before we begin, I'd like to give a little bit of context about how this series of workshops came into being and the overall project that we've been working on here. So the series of workshops that we've doing, practices of resistance in times of crisis, kind of stemmed from a conference that we organized last year and that we're repeating this year, Rethinking Gramsci. And while I'm here saying this, I'd like to mention that the name is an intertextual reference to Marcus's Green's Rethinking Gramsci book. And in that sense, we're not pretending to be original with the idea, but establish continuity with people who have already rethought Gramsci and done so eloquently and so competently. And we're just trying to insert ourselves in that tradition. So the idea of the conference of Rethinking Gramsci was to kind of explore some of these intersections between theory and practice. And a part of the workshop series was intended to think in more practical terms the relationship between social and political theory on one hand and social and political movements on the other, and to try to build connections between the two. I think a part of this has to do with the context that we're coming from, myself coming from Argentina, and Roberto and Cristina coming from the Italian academics, a place where there's perhaps a little bit more historically a more close relationship between academics and social movements, and where the university has often direct and profound effect in that local and national politics. And I think the experience of now of being uprooted and transferred to the context of the North American academia, trying to see some of the ways to strengthen this type of relationship between theory and practice, between social and political movements as an object of study and as a political practice. So it's a little bit in that with that idea that we put together a series of workshops. The first workshop was focused on the perspective of social movements. We invited a labor organizer and a history of labor and class social movements. Race and labor social movements. And in our second workshop, we invited a radio and podcast producer, as well as an AI researcher, to try to think through some of the problems of revolutionary subjectivity and explore the revolutionary potential of emergent media. All of these workshops have the same kind of theme of inviting someone that's involved in a social movement, community organizing, and some way the realm of ideas. And with that in mind, we invited Professor Thomas to speak with us about hegemony as not just a theory, as we'll see as he's in his talk today, but as a form of practice and indeed a political method. So we think a lot of these ideas kind of fit perfectly with the overall intention of this little project that we're doing. And so we're concluding this workshop series with these 3 workshops, but we do have other things planned for next year. And we also have our Rethinking Gramsci 2024 conference this May. You can find more information on our web, www.rethinkinggramsci.com, or on our Instagram. This is starting to sound a lot like a commercial, or wherever you find your symbolic goods. So please check out and follow what we're doing, and we'll post more information about our activities there. So I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Peter Thomas, the professor of the history of political thought and political theory at Brunel University London. He's the author of The Gramscian Moment, Philosophy, Hegemony, and Marxism, a book that has made a very large impact, as we're all aware, in the field, and more recently of radical politics on the cause of contemporary emancipation. As if teaching and writing and research wasn't enough, he is also on the editorial boards of the journals Historical Materialism and the International Gramsci Journal. First of all, I thank you, Professor Thomas, for participating, and I ask you all to join with me in welcoming him here today. This would be where I insert the applause track, but we can all hear it, right? And I ask for the organizers, can we highlight the speaker or spotlight on the Zoom? Wonderful. Okay, so thanks again, Professor.
Great, thank you very much, Roberto and Christina and Timothy, for the very kind invitation. I was very excited to receive this invitation. I've obviously heard a lot about the great work you've been doing over the other side of the pond, as they say here in the UK, around Gramsci and radical politics over the last years. But I was particularly excited because of the focus when Christina contacted me with the invitation to this event. I was fascinated with the idea of trying to bridge across from some of the more austere academic debates in which I'm sure many of us are involved, and talking to and with and about some concrete political and social movements in the contemporary world. And that seems to me a really interesting way of trying to revivify an important dimension of socialist and leftist culture, not just in the seminar room, but also as an organic community in some ways. So what I'd like to speak about today, I hope you've all been able to access the pre-circulated paper, and I'm not proposing, therefore, to read through it, but I will maybe just put it in context for you and speak a little bit about some of the motivations I had for making these propositions, and what I see as some perhaps of the relevant points to discuss in relation to thoughts about contemporary political organizing movements and so forth. So the paper is in some ways a sort of synthesis or a précis from a chapter in the recent book published. Timothy had mentioned Radical Politics. You can see there the cover. This book emerged as an attempt to try and think about some of Gramsci's ideas in relation to the social and political movements of the last, let's say, 30 years. So from the declaration of the New World Order by the first Bush president back in the early 90s through to contemporary movements. And what I was interested in doing here wasn't so much taking some of Gramsci's concepts ready-made and applying them to contemporary struggles, or declaring that Gramsci was always right, as tempting as such a proposition might be. I got more interested in trying to think about the ways that the types of debates that have been going on in radical political circles over the last 20 or 30 years might help us to read Gramsci in different ways and to focus on different types of concepts in his work. Sometimes concepts that had been largely neglected in the past, or sometimes concepts that we thought we already knew, but we could perhaps see in a new light, in the light of contemporary movements. So it was a dual reading, in a way, an attempt to read Gramsci in relation to these movements of the last 30 years, to read these movements of the last 30 years in relation to Gramsci and to mix things up and see the way that we might be able to shine a different type of light both on Gramsci and on some of our contemporary concerns. And in that process, I explore a range of different dimensions of Gramsci's thought, but in some ways a centerpiece of my argument is an attempt to try and think through the now widely diffused notion of hegemony, perhaps in some different types of ways, or at least in ways that would seem to me to be directly relevant to the challenges that many contemporary social and political movements are confronting. It's very interesting. Derek Boothman did an excellent analysis some years ago of looking at the presence of the word hegemony in the English language. And a very interesting analysis using corpus linguistics and looking through various texts. And he noted that the word hegemony before the early 1970s really wasn't all that frequently used in the English language. If you look across a range of publications, it was there, it had been used, there were certain discussions associated with it, but it wasn't a particularly significant word or a key concept, if we wanted. From the early 1970s onwards, that picture is dramatically changed. There's an absolute explosion, the use of the word hegemony everywhere. And when it's all mapped out on a graph, it's just stunning to see. It literally just goes like this. There's a massive spike that keeps going. And in lots of ways, that's because the word hegemony gets going and is diffused so widely in the English language due to the types of debates that the New Left were having around the reception of Gramsci's works in those periods and the way that discussion developed. And so they developed a huge range of interpretations and notions of hegemony, both in relation to Gramsci and in relation to other traditions for whom the term had been important in different ways. And I think we're all well aware there have been some monumental intellectual projects conducted under the sign of hegemony, if you want. Broad theories of political modernity to sophisticated political philosophies, fascinating historical investigations. We can think about some of the big names with which we're all familiar. Origi's thoughts on hegemony and the whole mapping out of the dynamics of the modern world system. Laclau and Mouffe's work in their jointly authored works and separately elaborating very interesting perspectives. Ranajit Guha's fundamental interventions that reshaped the whole field of post-colonial studies and much further afield. Partha Chatterjee, the list could go on in all sorts of different directions, reflecting upon the way the word hegemony, in a sense, has become so contested precisely because of its centrality. It's universally acknowledged as an important point of reference, and the debates begin from the moment when people are trying to work out what emphasis to focus upon or where to extend it in which particular disciplines or fields. What I tried to do in the book and in this brief paper to which you've had access was to think through another dimension of hegemony. I'm not denying if you're looking for a big, massive theory of political modernity, the prison notebooks, that's the place to go. You're going to find a lot of interesting stuff. Certainly not denying fascinating perspectives in terms of political philosophies or political theories that we can find there in one or more of the many varied usages of hegemony that Gramsci makes throughout the prison notebooks. But what really got interesting for me was trying to think about what Gramsci was doing with the word hegemony, not just in the prison notebooks, but from much earlier when he first encounters this term during his period in Russia and engages directly in the debates and the legacies of the debates amongst the Bolsheviks about the importance of hegemony in the Russian revolutionary process. And the way those reflections, in a sense, Gramsci carries them back with him to Italy and continues to elaborate them in a whole variety of different directly practical ways in his role as a revolutionary leader prior to his imprisonment. And then what I would regard as equally directly practical, albeit also theoretical ways, in the political project of the prison notebooks. And it's this important trace of thinking about hegemony as a different way of doing politics that I found quite fascinating, and I thought could be a certain type of lens we could bring to some of the problems that have been confronted by radical social and political movements opposing the New World Order or the neoliberal consensus, or however we would choose to characterize our current and ongoing misery. This dimension, I think, you can find throughout Gramsci's prison notebooks. You can always look and go for various citations here and there and take things out of context. But I think you can also find it in terms of the overall project that he attempts to develop. The prison notebooks, in many ways, I think could be summed up as an attempt to find a way of doing politics precisely from the position of one who has been denied that possibility. In some ways, I think that's not a bad way to describe or to think of the reality of what it means to be radicalized in contemporary society. We want to engage in meaningful forms of mass politics, but we're all well aware that the cards are stacked against us, that the opportunities to break out of the various minoritarian silos, ghettos, whatever we'd call them, into which we're normally shunted, can be quite difficult to find. So in some ways, the experience Gramsci was going through in his attempt to think about a different way of doing politics isn't all that different from the types of problems that we confront as we attempt to find some leverage point to engage in meaningful, radical political action today. There were 4 particular elements that I tried to focus upon in this paper and in this book that I think give us some guiding points, 4 sorts of principles that I've tried to distill from this dialogue between Gramsci in his time and the social and political radical movements of our own time, which I might discuss a little bit now to give some sense of why I see them as so important, or to set an agenda for us to think about the types of issues we've been confronting recently. So the 4 principles I tried to distill from this thought experiment in which I engaged were, firstly, thinking about hegemony as the foundation of a new order, or maybe even better, as a process of new ordering. Thinking about hegemony as an instance of historical progress. Thinking about hegemony in terms of leadership of a distinctive time, leadership as a process of risk, of experimentation, perhaps even of fragility, and of hegemony as the attempt to construct or to practice something like a pedagogical laboratory. And so I'll try and just talk through some of those 4 elements in terms of why I think they're significant in Gramsci's thinking, but then why I think they're particularly useful for us to take from Gramsci and move through to think about our own challenges. So firstly, in terms of thinking about hegemony as a new order, I think this is particularly important. In Gramsci's time, he's coming out of a culture where there is a confidence, obviously, in the socialist and the communist project. There's an attempt not just to engage in acts of resistance, of critique, of refusal, of all of those options of which we're very familiar, but actually to think concretely about what is involved in the foundation of a new type of society, structured according to radically different principles from those that dominate current society. And I was very interested in the way in which, in Gramsci's thinking, the concept of prefiguration, with which we might be familiar from contemporary debates, is in some ways prefigured. Because Gramsci is very alert to thinking through the traces of the future that can be found in the forms and the means of struggle in the present. So, and he's very interested in thinking this in what you could call an aesthetic sense of a figure, of a prefiguration, of a shaping, or of a molding and the possibility of understanding social order, political order, not in terms of systems of dominance, of governance as they previously existed, but in terms of popular empowerment. So a conception of a popular political order, if we want. And that seems to me particularly important for us to try and think through all those points of challenges where various cycles of movements over the last 20 or 30 years press up against certain limits. There are mass mobilizations around different themes. And then the problem is posed of where next? What are the forms and potentials of institutionalizing or concretizing these protests, these acts of resistance, of building something viable as a longer term project? And that seems to me very decisive, that Gramsci provides us with resources to think through some of issues around those debates as we've known them. The second element, in some ways, I think might be the most decisive dimension of all. Hegemony for Gramsci is very much about producing historical progress. He doesn't have any apologies for that. He doesn't feel shy about it at all. He belongs to a generation of revolutionaries who are firmly convinced of the desirability and the feasibility of getting history to move forward in some way. Now, we're coming at this from a very different end, and we've got a whole wreckage of a century coming after us that's made us perhaps a little bit more cynical around notions of historical progress in general. I'm sure we're all aware of various critiques that can be made of it, various claims to teleology, various claims of involvement with the various forms of dominance in political modernity, colonialism, imperialism, and so forth. And of course, all those critiques are entirely valid insofar as they're aiming at those particular targets. In Gramsci's case, however, there's a very different sense of historical progress, and one that I think is understood as a process of imminent problem solving. So as I noted in the paper, one of the issues that is confronted, that Gramsci confronts quite directly, are the contradictions in the process of unfolding of bourgeois political modernity in its liberal forms. And despite its various claims to liberty, equality, fraternity, and so forth, the concrete limits that are posed upon those practices by the very foundational structures of bourgeois society, that sets an historical problem that needs to be solved in some form. And Gramsci identifies that very clearly in terms of understanding the nature of the property question and its relationship to class power, and developing the political practices that are able to break that deadlock. It would similarly function, as I suggest in the paper, when we think through the various contradictions in the so-called abolition of slavery in the modern world, a process, of course, which we know from historical studies is not quite as completed as some would have us suppose, not even in those countries that supposedly amended their constitution to achieve it, with an amendment that didn't, in fact, juridically abolish slavery as such, but merely limited it to certain instances, which is one factor, of course, that's led into the entire carceral, industrial, military complex in North America. But the abolition of slavery of one particular instance poses then the problem of the abolition of various other forms of unfreedom that continue to exist in the modern world, and not least of all the institution of wage slavery, which now as then remains absolutely fundamental to the way in which societies are structured. Gramsci is quite clear that the historical progress he envisages isn't simply going to descend from on high or be given to us. It's something that needs to be actively constructed in the perspective of a problem-solving process. And that also seems to me something to think through in terms of the various radical movements that we've experienced in more recent years, of the types of concrete problems they're confronting and the way they conceive of their actions in relation to them. So as a concrete example, when we think about the current catastrophic climate crisis that we're experiencing, which with every passing day is having even more disastrous effects around the globe in all of the uneven ways that occur in the capitalist mode of production, I think our our culture and our project needs to unashamedly affirm that it would indeed be historical progress to achieve carbon zero. It would indeed be historical progress to abolish fossil fuel industries. It would indeed be historical progress for the fusion of various forms of technologies around the globe and the capacities for rethinking ecologies, scales, economies, and so forth. We don't need to be ashamed of this or frightened of claims that go along with it in order to inspire the types of mass movements that we're required to bring an end to the seeming impending end of the world. It is going to require precisely that conviction that the politics we're proposing will make things better and will represent the beginning of constructing a better world. The third element that I found thinking about Gramsci in this way, in hegemony, was thinking through the notion of hegemony as leadership. Obviously, hegemony often gets mixed up with a whole range of other concepts. There's quite a few attempts, I think, often to think about hegemony basically in Weberian terms as an instance of domination. There are a whole variety of different attempts to think about hegemony in some ways as a sort of sovereignty light. And there are various ways of thinking about hegemony in very generic terms as power of one type or another, whether cultural power, social power, whatever it would be. I was much more interested in thinking through the synonymous usage that Gramsci has between hegemony and direction, direzione, in Italian, which is a synonymous usage you find also in the way Lenin and many other Bolsheviks had been using the term, where hegemony is thought of in terms of leadership. But again, here there was a problem of thinking about what we mean as leadership. I think particularly in the wake of various alternative globalization movements and critiques that were made of different types of leadership, of debates between horizontalism and verticalism, which were particularly prominent, let's say, 20 years ago or so. There's a tendency to think in quite a caricatured way about leadership as some type of power to impose one's will upon others, which doesn't really capture the reality or the difficulty of trying to provide instances of leadership in concrete political struggles. So if we think here about what happens, let's say in a trade union meeting where there are various proposals on the table and they're being vigorously debated, there's a point where an intervention needs to happen to shift that discussion in one direction or another, to mobilize a certain number of trade union militants behind one particular proposal for action rather than another. It takes a lot of courage to step forward in those spaces with particular proposals, to sort of lay things out there and hope that you'll find support for this proposal and people will see this as a viable path of development and as a way of engaging in meaningful political action. So in this type of leadership, which I think in some ways, in any form of democratic politics, is the nature of leadership, there's a real risk involved and a real fragility. There's always the possibility that a proposal is not going to be heard. There's the possibility that just because one particular militant may have been the leader of a process yesterday, maybe things have shifted, maybe ideas have moved along, maybe someone else has developed a better proposal that can mobilize more people, keep energies up in different directions. And I was very interested in thinking about how that's quite a constructive way for us to think about not just any individual movement that we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years, but of the intersection between them and the way there's been a sort of spilling across different cycles of different principles. So I was thinking here in particular, for those who have been engaged with them, thinking through some of the debates in the alternative globalization movement and the way they morphed in different ways into anti-war movements, say 20 years ago at the start of the unending war on terror, the way these pivoted and turned through into, let's say, student movement protests, say around 2010 in different ways. And the way many of the themes and debates then they're taken up, they move through debates in a revived feminist movement around social reproduction. They'll move into debates around environmental issues, moving through in debates around anti-racism struggles, moving through around debates around abolitionism, against apartheid in Palestine, and so forth. So there's been a range of these instances of leadership in terms of the themes and the way that they've been translated across different cycles of struggles, but also in terms of I think the practices of leadership, and it's become much more diffuse. The type of concrete political environment Gramsci was dealing with, I think, is returning in terms of the way these different radical movements have been relating to each other and translating each other and learning from each other, which is also an important and decisive instance of understanding ultimately what leadership involves, both the teaching, if you will, of the movement, but also the learning from the movement. And this comes back to a theme that was very, very dear to Gramsci, and it was central to Marx's thinking in his very brief but incredibly dense theses on Feuerbach, and thinking through, well, who's going to educate the educator? And it's that type of dialectic, I think, that best captures the notion of hegemony as a practice of a distinctive type of democratic and enabling leadership. So finally, then, the fourth element of thinking about hegemony, in some ways summarizing these previous elements, was the notion of hegemony as a type of pedagogical laboratory. So it's a place for experimentation, it's a place for learning. Gramsci, in his work, this all comes down to him in this very mythical form when he proposes the notion of a modern prince. And there's a long process of development of thinking about this, and all sorts of different elements flow into thinking about what's involved in the notion of a modern prince. It's not just some sort of a code word or a synonym for the political party. Gramsci's he's thinking big with this one. He's really trying to understand what's the mythical dimensions that I can find here in the modern prince that can describe a type of political dynamic of a hegemonic type of politics. And it involves the way in which popular movements learn from their own experiences and learn to understand their own capacities for self-direction, for self-leadership, perhaps also for self-teaching. And as Gramsci develops that idea in his context, he's then interested in thinking through the institutional forms that would necessarily flow from that type of politics. And it would, in some ways, launch us forward to a new type of political organization or political party. I think we need to lose the various forms of fear that elements of the left have around the term party. Whether we call something a party or not, that is the way it is going to function politically in relation to movements and in relation to other political interests. It involves the emergence of a new type of party, if you want, but in some ways returns us back to the dynamism of the political party as an historical experience of popular struggles, and the way this emerged as quite a special new type of institution in modern society, where people would come together to engage in political action in a meaningful form, almost a sort of city within a city, if you wanted to take this back and think in classical terms. And it's those dimensions of trying to think about hegemony in an expansive sense as a practice, but also as quite a concrete one that almost flows organically into the formation of what Gramsci would call a collective will, that seemed to me quite fundamental for us to think about today, when we have a whole series of different intersecting struggles occurring on a wide variety of different fronts. And I appreciate I may sound somewhat optimistic. That's okay, because as I get older, I think it's just so much easier to be pessimistic. So I'm happy to take the charge of being overly optimistic here. But I think we can see real signs of optimism and positive signs of dynamic developments in the way in recent years there's been a rapid translation between movements. So just think around the period emerging and going into and coming out of the pandemic, of the mass mobilizations that have occurred around different issues, around anti-racist struggles, around housing struggles, around anti-war struggles, abolitionist struggles, anti-apartheid struggles and so forth, and the way in which a whole series of different actors have been moving across these movements and have been learning from each of their experiences. We're obviously not at a stage where all of those struggles have coalesced in such a way we could talk about some type of new international, but we're certainly talking about a very vibrant terrain of experimentation and of learning and of practice in which different communities of radicalized people, different interest groups, beginning to listen to each other and learn from each other in different ways. And this also is that dimension of hegemony as a process of distinctive leadership to which I referred. So that's the pitch, as it were, what I was trying to reflect upon and encourage other people, if they wish to join me in reflecting upon, to think about hegemony as a method of political work. Think about this word hegemony. It's one of those big words that makes us all so unhappy, but it might also be one of those little simple words in a way that can help us to describe some very basic, almost molecular dimensions of what it means to engage in radical political action. I'll leave things there. I'm really keen to engage in discussion. And just to note as well, it's really wonderful to see so many old friends and comrades here tonight. So yeah, I hope to catch up with everyone in person and not virtually, but hopefully physically co-located at some point very soon.
Thank you. I will take from here if that's okay. Thank you so much, Peter, for this very stimulating presentation. When we were thinking about this workshop, we were like discussing about how too often we hear the term hegemony used today, alas, also in reactionary context, but very few times it is this accurately described. So thank you for that. Now, as you pointed out, the historical and thus contextual dimension in which Gramsci's thought unfold is crucial to understand this notion. And this for young academics, and I speak also for myself, the Gramscian Moment was an extraordinary text for deepening into that, precisely because it highlights the historical dimension on two levels, like the obvious Gramsci's personal one, and the theoretical one with the many-folded aspect of what you also call the absolute historicism. And so, since the historical horizon is the battlefield in which hegemonic struggles unfold, in this regard, I really appreciated the definition you gave of new order as this / relocation of existing contradiction. And so since this historical horizon is the battlefield, and since progress is a concrete making, as you say in the paper, I would like to open the conversation on some thematic prompts that I think might be related to contemporaneity, given that contemporaneity is our own historical horizon. And so the prompts would be, what are to you the contradictions that exist today, and how can they be turned around or relocated in such a way that they can be used as a concrete making? And the other one, which is related to this, would be, what could be a concrete example of a pedagogical laboratory for a new self-emancipatory policy? That is, what could be an operative modern prince today, considering also the reluctance that especially young generations feels towards political parties and political movements. You are muted, Peter.
Sorry, it seems like we've all been saying that to each other for the last 4 years or so. Now you're still muted. Yeah, thanks very much for those very insightful comments, Roberta. They're tough ones to answer in a way, but thinking through, so the contradictions that exist today, the fundamental scandal of capitalist society is the sale of labor power as a commodity. That's the fundamental thing on which the whole system hangs together, and the various means by which that's achieved. It's quite astounding, the range of the ways in which wage slavery is continually proposed and reproposed and solidified in contemporary societies, and the way it exploits various divisions continuously in order to reassert itself as an unassailable principle of organizing social life. So at that level, the fundamental contradictions that exist today, without sounding a little bit too much like a dinosaur, seem to me the type of fundamental contradictions of which we've long been aware, and the regulation of labor markets and the forms and structures of resistance against them. What does that mean? Is this an appeal to some old mythical figure of the mass working class against the capitalist? I think there we need to be historically concrete and see the way in which, in reality, the working class has always been composed of a diversity of a variety of experiences of exploitation, of subjugation, of subalternization, which is the way I discuss some of these themes in the book in relation to some of Gramsci's reflection on subalternity. And it's precisely those elements of thinking through the way in which various identities and experiences, not just of injustice or oppression, but crucially, the various identities and experiences of struggle against those conditions can come together and work together in a common project, which does not necessarily mean they're going to be unified or agree on every point, but can find in the process of active struggle points of translation between the various concerns and instances as a beginning point for thinking through, well, what would alternative forms of social organization be that wouldn't rely upon this sort of almost concretized metaphysical proposition that we regard ourselves as the bearers of some type of a miraculous power that can be converted into monetary forms by contractual means, and the whole way that the labor process is regulated. That would seem to me that as a fundamental contradiction is one that essentially needs to be reasserted as the terrain of our activity in a whole variety of different ways. Another central point that I think has become increasingly relevant is just simply going to keep exploding the distinctions between so-called citizens and non-citizens in a whole variety of different societies and status of citizenship itself, and the way we're thinking through the coming together of instances of popular power in relation to those problems. So in other words, the whole problem of the critique of the nation state, not just as a theoretical problem, but practically and concretely, what do you do in instances of undocumented migrant workers, of migration flows? How is all of this going to continue to be intensified in all the processes of massive climate migration that are going to be going on? I mean, they're going to be happening now. Summer is, getting going in big areas of the world where the impacts this year are going to be even worse than they were last year and next year. This is going to lead to all sorts of mass flows and all sorts of dislocations occurring. We're well aware that there are massive movements on the right mobilizing around these issues and attempting to build walls and blockages and so forth. Where are the points that we're intervening in these contradictions? What forms of solidarity are we building? What alternative identities and narratives are we constructing? They also seem to me quite decisive. So there's a range of other massive contradictions we can discuss, because our world is basically just composed of nothing but contradictions, but they would seem to be in particular two big areas where there's some real urgency to intensify our efforts. In terms of a concrete example of a pedagogical laboratory, I suppose the glib way for me to respond would be that if I could find one easily, I'd be a member of it. Unfortunately, it's not quite so easy in the context we're currently working in. But I think there are instances and we can see processes, if not of a modern prince, maybe of a pre-modern prince, of a modern prince-esque dynamic of different movements speaking to each other. I'd referred to the way in which, over the last 4 years, we've seen this flow on. I was seeing it occurring, the way mobilizations around housing, for example, at the start of the pandemic, and about the differential impact of the pandemic in class terms, flowed over into Black Lives Matters protests and movements. And there were various feminist mobilizations running alongside those in supportive ways, in ways that people maybe hadn't expected. And the way a lot of the cultures that emerged in those processes and the struggles against the different levels of contradiction throughout the pandemic, I think we can see quite clearly on the streets, have really morphed over and connected with various struggles around migrant rights, Islamophobia, for example, and have now obviously in the midst of massive conflicts stepped over into many discussions around apartheid in Palestine, genocide in Gaza, and so forth. So, as I said, maybe we're not at the point of the foundation of another new international. Okay, we're not seeing things at that level of formalization, but we are seeing political cultures that are talking to each other, that are learning from each other, that are translating between each other in really productive and exciting ways. And if that's the wave that's currently going, that's where I think we need to get on, and we need to be surfing that wave. That's the space in which concrete questions of organization, the possibilities of, whether we call them coalitions or united fronts or whatever, where they can be built in relation to that dynamic.
Thank you so much for your answer. I will be taking questions now for Peter, for those who wish. So please raise your hand. Yeah, Dominic?
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. I have just a fairly simple question on progress. You spoke of course, hegemony and the process of hegemonizing as implying, in a way or another, the concept or the notion of historical progress, or of a somewhat process of immanent problem solving. And you noted, of course, the problematic aspect or kernel of this idea. And in my own studies and in my own conversations, and which are sometimes quite hotly debated with my post-structuralist friends, or my in the university where I study. This notion of progress is seen as sometimes in itself irrecoverable, as being colonial and so on, Eurocentrist and so on. And I wondered how do you treat about this aspect with Gramsci, and what you do in those kind of conversations, and how do you keep this notion of this process of immanent learning, which from my understanding is kind of necessary to have an emancipatory notion of historical development. So I would just like to have some more, for you to expand on this.
Sure, thanks for that, Dominic. As I said, I think being unapologetic about championing historical progress is really quite crucial, but it obviously involves us being very clear about how we're defining progress. And we can, in a sense, settle certain types of debates that emerge by agreeing that we're thinking of historical progress as determined by an end goal that we know in advance. Well, then probably, that's a little bit silly, because let's face it, none of us really know where our lives are going to end up. We don't have it all mapped out from the outset. That's just not the way human beings function, fortunately. So there's a little bit of a sort of straw person targeting going on with those notions. Certainly, there have been historical instances where people were convinced that they were carrying forward history's mission and so forth. In left-wing cultures have done quite a bit of damage, but it's not one that we need to detain ourselves with so much today. What's really decisive about this politically is this. I think let's say we're a group of radicalized people with a radical perspective on the way society is currently functioning. We've got some political proposals we want to take into a trade union meeting, into a community meeting, whatever it would be, a place where there are normal people, so not the geeky people like us who have got a whole bunch of Adornos sitting on our bookshelves or whatever else we do with our time, but normal human beings who are living their lives and doing all the stuff that human beings do. If we go into that meeting and we can't offer them the prospect that our political proposal is going to make their lives and the lives of their kids and their grandkids better, what is it exactly that we're doing? We're playing to lose. We're trying to convince them to be ascetics like us or become monks, or what are we doing? I mean, politics is always about winning support because you're offering people a vision of a better life. If it's not about that, then what are we doing engaged in popular politics? And I don't think you can do that without any conception of saying, these proposals are going to make things better. We're going to solve a problem. And that's the sense in which historical progress is a problem-solving process. We might not know where we're going to end up finally. We may never build the New Jerusalem, but we certainly know precisely what the problem is here today. And that's the fact that there are some people who are being threatened with redundancy or unemployment, or that's the fact that there is an area that's being polluted, or that's the fact that carbon emissions are increasing in areas, or whatever the issue might be, you can see as a problem that needs to be solved. And it's not going to be determined by whatever proposals made by various individuals, however well-meaning or radical they will be. It will be the types of issues where mass movements gather around them and find ways of agreeing that there are certain problems that need to be solved. They'll disagree on the ways they should be solved, but that's a part of the process of political struggle and popular empowerment, of working through those disagreements and finding ways to move forward, to eliminate the things that are currently holding us in check. So I think we need to be a little bit less shy about championing the notion of progress in those terms, because without that, it's hard for me to see how we can actually confidently go forward and attempt to provide leadership in those movements and moments of resistance. Movements and moments of resistance, people being discontent, will always continually re-emerge. The real political question is, where are they going to go? And some of that involves the responsibilities of leadership, of people taking a risk, of putting forward a proposal that here's the way that we could come together and work on this collectively to address this problem. And that seems to me quite fundamental for any type of radical culture that genuinely wants to win politically, that isn't just content to sit in the seminar room or to get the tenured position in the university or whatever it is, but really wants to contribute to real movements that make a concrete difference in the world.
I'll take other questions. Dave? Oh, no, okay. Marcus? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for this, Peter. The mapping out these 4 perspectives of hegemony, I think, is very useful. It makes me want to go back and read the text and see how these 4 different perspectives sort of illuminate. And it's often, hegemony, as you mentioned, is so elusive in reading the notebooks because he uses it in different ways in different contexts. So I found this very illuminating and helpful. So thank you very much for that. I wanted to press you on the idea of prefiguration. In many discussions, it's strange to hear people that claim the opposite of what you're claiming, is that Gramsci doesn't offer any prefigurative notions of politics, which I think is completely absurd. But in the paper that you distributed, there's a paragraph, and I just wanted to get your thinking to expand on it a bit. The sentence, this is from your paper, page 3. You said, this conception of prefiguration is not a theory of the actualization of a latent potential in which a partial social element, marginal or excluded from the existing political order, expands and progressively displaces its antagonist. And then you go on to explain, essentially, I mean, to say that the subaltern are not excluded, they're internal to the integral state and so on. But when I think about the gradations of subaltern groups that Gramsci puts forward, it seems to be this idea that the subaltern, it is trying to displace its antagonist. Even though I would say that the subaltern is always internal to the integral state, but it is trying to displace the antagonist. And you explain later in the paper about autonomy, the struggle for autonomy. And so I agree with you on the point. I think that the struggle for autonomy is a prefigurative politics and a hegemonic politics as well. But I would just wanted to press you on that paragraph just to see what your thinking is on those terms.
Thanks, Marcus. There's a lot of meat on the barbecue there. Yeah, I think one of the fascinating things about hegemony in the prison notebooks is there is no one definition of it, because that's not what Gramsci is really doing with it. There's a whole range of different meanings that he associates with it, and he's inherited that from listening in on a variety of debates and different usages, and he's using it in a bunch of different directions, which is precisely why it can be developed off in the level of a reflection upon geopolitics, a reflection upon the nature of social order and so forth, and a whole variety of different areas. It's more like a sort of semantic field rather than just one word or a concept, which is maybe why it's so infinitely productive and rich to think through these different possible meanings and what you can do with each of them in different types of contexts. As you were discussing there around notions of prefiguration, my mind was going precisely to famous Paschid's discussing the different gradations of subalternity that you highlighted. And there it seems to me quite significant to think through what happens in that process, because it's not exactly a ladder that the subaltern groups climb up. There are all sorts of refluxes and reflexes that are going on, course and discourse, things going up and down and backwards. There are instances of some struggles taking a step forward in one direction, but then a recuperation by the established order, the formation of semi-autonomous forms of political organization, which have nevertheless decapitated and included in transformist ways in the existing system. Things flare up again and steps are taken in another direction. So it's sort of two steps forward, one step back continuously. But what I find fascinating about Gramsci's discussion of those themes is the way in which in that process, in all of its contradictions and steps forward and backwards, this is a process of the subalterns, as it were, desubalternizing themselves. They can't, by definition, be desubalternized by other political forces external to them. And it's not the relationship to their antagonist that defines them as subaltern. A part of the learning experience the subalterns are going through in those forms of political struggle is to understand the extent to which their subalternity is one in which they have actively engaged. So it hasn't simply been a question of being passive victims of history, but it's been a process in which the subalterns have been involved in subalternizing themselves because of a failed recognition of their own self-organizational capacities, of their own capacities to be self-directive. How do they learn in that emergence out of conditions of subalternity? It's precisely the discoveries that are made when they're engaging actively in a process that they had perhaps previously thought to be only passively suffering. And it's in those elements that I think where I was really thinking around notions of prefiguration, that the instances occur themselves in a process of struggle. there's something I've been thinking about recently, a fascinating discussion in some aspects of the Southern question, where Gramsci comes around and says, well, what is it that l'ordine nuovo was trying to do, in the 2 big red years in Turin? And he says, fundamentally, it's about this idea of hegemony and so forth. Now, he's saying that on the other side of his period in Bolshevik Russia. He's saying that after a long period in Vienna, return to Italy, assumption of leadership of the party and so forth. When you turn and go back to look at what l'ordine nuovo was actually publishing and talking about during the red years in Turin and the strike areas, good luck finding the term hegemony. It's not the language they're using at the time and thinking in those terms. It's a discovery Gramsci makes from his engagement with the Bolshevik discussions. And it's the way he rethinks his own political history to think about what concretely was happening in the formation of workers' councils, in the intersection of the various interest groups, of all the regional dimensions that came into play there as well. So that was an instance, I think, also of prefiguration occurring, that Gramsci understood the process of struggle and the new alliances or new configurations, new relations of force that emerged in the act of doing politics, as not merely an instance of resistance, but also as one of construction of the potential forms, the outlines of a future organization of society. And this keeps coming back, I think, throughout his discussions. It'll come up in this very pregnant mythical form of the modern prince. The whole purpose of Gramsci engaging with that tradition of Machiavellian reflections in Italian thought, which is much more, I think it's hard for people outside the Italian framework, and particularly the Italian framework of the 1920s, to get a sense of what's going on with that discourse around Machiavelli, and also in terms of the prison notebooks around Dante. When Gramsci's engaging in those discussions, he's not just talking about academic figures, he's talking about cultural reference points that are almost just intuitive to Italians as they're moving through the world. They're part of a national tradition. They're taught in schools, they're discussed in newspapers, they're a language that's used. When Gramsci's engaging with that Machiavellian discussion with the notion of the modern prince, he's very much thinking of the prince as a figure. In a way, it's providing a concrete example of a type of mythical form. He's telling a story to get people to think about forms of popular empowerment as well. So as I suggested, I think there's a very strong aesthetic sense in what Gramsci's doing with that. And in a way, it's as if engaging in struggle, engaging in politics, it gives you new ways of seeing things. And that's a part of the process of prefiguring as well, that you start to see the figures or the shapes emerge in current struggles that might constitute the potential for future, more consolidated, institutionalized social forms in a future society.
Cristina?
Okay. Thank you, Peter, for your talk and for joining us today. It was a pleasure for us to listen to the way you expanded your paper. I was just thinking about what you just said, between the differences between precursorial writings, and then I was thinking about the notebooks and the nature of the notebooks in the way in which we can see and trace almost an evolution of how Gramsci uses different concepts, and hegemony is one of those in which we see that we cannot grasp what he means because it constantly evolves. So I was thinking about that, and I wanted to ask you if when you were writing about these 4 principles that you just explained to us, you see that there is kind of an evolution in the direction in which Gramsci is going from precursorial writings to the notebooks, and even in the notebooks, if from the beginning to the end, you see that these concepts, these principles coexist, or if towards the end he has he leans toward one in a more specific way. I don't know if it makes sense. If not, I can just reiterate it.
No, that's great. I mean, it's very interesting to think through, you know, for Gramsci, but I think for any really interesting political thinker, maybe any interesting thinker in general, to think about how their thought develops through time. I think in Gramsci's case, it's pretty similar to any really interesting thinker, that you certainly have an evolutionary process of development going on, but it's one punctuated by contradictions and ruptures throughout its development, which nevertheless doesn't mean that we're not dealing with a certain organic coherence to the overall process. In Gramsci's case, I think there is an important constant, the sort of thing that guides him along. It's something that it can be difficult for us to get our heads around in a way. I mean, Gramsci's growing up as a young person in a colonized society, dealing, you know, with various personal, physical challenges, attempting to get a grip on all of the inequalities and forms of injustice in society to which he's been born. And he goes off on a long odyssey, as it were. You know, takes him right to the center of world revolution in Russia and back again into fascist jail cells and so forth. But the one constant element there is that, and you can see this in his journalistic writings, Gramsci's constantly looking to do something. So he's always looking for some point of intervention, to shift something, to make something different. You know, when you think about his quite stunning theatrical criticism he used to write in Turin, looking back over some of those pieces, texts that aren't really, I think, read as often as they should be. But, you know, Gramsci, he's going along to the theatre once a week for years, and he's writing theatre reviews. So that's how he gets his start, as it were. And he's just fascinated of thinking through the cultural significance of different theatrical productions. He's fascinated to look at the audience and see how they're responding, thinking about that in relation to contemporary political, social, and cultural issues. You can see he's thinking of theatre criticism as a critique of life, as a way of intervening, of shifting something. And that's a continuity you see running throughout all of his work before prison, and I would argue in prison as well. That he brings a very practical, concrete focus to his understanding, which is occurring in the context of mass political parties and mobilizations involving millions of people. I mean, a political culture that's it's sometimes quite difficult for many of us to get our heads around, because it's so different from the relatively minoritarian scenes with which we might be more familiar. But his conceptions then focused in this practical register of a concrete critique of existing society, in the sense of actions emerging to transform it, I think is one important constant that guides the evolution of his thinking, even when there are various changes and shifts in it. And, you know, if we think, you know, a life, we would hope our own lives would have some sort of coherence or shape or form where we sort of gather together the various contradictions and the different roles we've played. And if we're lucky, you know, maybe we get to bring it all together or finally understand what all of this stuff meant. You know, hopefully a long time before we come to the end of it. But, you know, if we understand any of it at all before it ends, we're probably fairly lucky. In Gramsci's case, it undertakes this long trajectory, and I find it quite fascinating that in his later notebooks, after he's elaborated the idea of the modern prince, which he only actually mentions a couple of times in a very short period of time in 1932, and after that disappears, as it were, it pops up, fascinating discussion, and then that doesn't appear again. But he does engage in continuing explorations in the very difficult years, 33, 34, 35, until his writing capacity is effectively extinguished, in exploring what Francesca Antonini has fascinatingly called a sort of a new conception of politics in those later notebooks. And I think he's very interested in thinking through, he starts looking back historically at different forms of popular empowerment, at different popular sensibilities, at forms of mobilization of energies of popular classes, of ways of organizing them. And I think it's not an accident at all that some of the final writings he'll be undertaking. I see Peter Ives here in the meeting. It's an area he's studied very deeply. Gramsci will be thinking through issues around grammar. He'll be thinking around what's involved in the organization of a language. There are traces there. I mean, towards the end of his life, he is literally physically falling apart. So we shouldn't raise the bar too high and expect too much. But you can certainly see traces where that continual exploration to think about new forms of politics, new practices of politics, new ways of doing politics in a different way, or doing politics in a way that isn't able to be integrated quite so readily into the standard narrative of subalternization of the modern bourgeois integral state. They will become the areas he's trying to explore more. So there's a certain continuity and fidelity in his evolution, even if there are a whole variety of detours and different themes that he'll be treating along the way.
Other questions? Well, if that's the case, I might take advantage of you having you here, Peter, and I will ask you another question myself, a very brief one, maybe before letting you go, considering the time zone here there in England. In the paper that we circulated, there is a passage, obviously, on leadership, and I wonder, what is your take on there is this aspect in the prison notebook that about leaderism that Gramsci defines Caesarism or Cesarismo. And I wonder, because in the left it's often a discussion whether to rely on a Caesar or those type of leaderistic figure or not. And I don't know, I wanted to ask you, what are the limits of relying on those type of figures, and what are, on the contrary, the possibilities?
Yeah, this is obviously a very important theme in Gramsci's work around notions of Caesarism, also Bonapartism, distinctions between them, and much important work has been done on these themes in general, and in relation to Gramsci by the sadly departed Domenico Lasordo, but also some very important work to cite again, Francesca Antonini, published an important book on this. Gramsci, clearly, this is a broader discussion in the period. He engages with that carefully, and he considers its implications for understanding politics in different dimensions. So he has a reflection related to politics in Western Europe, but also, obviously, there's a subtext and there's a reflection upon what's occurring in the Soviet Union, and his understanding of those processes. And often you have quite a historically nuanced assessment of different dimensions, concretely, that different political figures play in different historical periods. Ultimately, for Gramsci, the instance of Caesarism devolves into one of those forms of subalternization inherent to modern politics, and so much of his thinking is aimed at generating the capacity to resist the reemergence of those types of practices. And he has a lot of reflections really engage with Machiavellian themes. A very famous line, important reflection. So it is a primordial fact of politics. It's an element we find in Machiavelli. The elitists of his time, Moscow and so forth, have been discussing these themes. Yeah, there is an element. They really are the leaders and the led in human societies. I mean, there's no point denying this. There are some people involved in certain authority relations, other people who are subservient to them and so forth. That's not the real question. That's the primordial fact of politics. That's where you start from. The real question is, are things going to stay like that forever? Is there capacity for transformation? Can the followers one day become the leaders the next? Are there possibilities of transitions? And he elaborates a conception of politics, I think, as I've discussed it, that would see politics itself, or hegemonic politics as a different type of politics, as a learning of the processes of desubalternization, which, to come back to some of the themes Marcus raised, is quite a complex phenomenon, because it isn't just one of the subalterns throwing off their oppressors. It isn't just one of the subalterns refusing, as it were, the ruling classes. It's one of the subalterns themselves desubalternizing the practices and the forms that they continually reproduced in themselves as a condition of their subalternity. So it's a learning process. And this is also where I think Gramsci's very, very fascinating, that there's always a dimension. It can sometimes be explicit, often implicit, but there's always a dimension where Gramsci establishes a structure for thinking about politics that on the one hand is deeply, if you like, structural, is deeply focused on the bigger relations of force in any given society, but on the other hand has some quite profound ethical implications, or ethical implications for the individual and the structure and the formation of the personality or the subjectivity, whatever term we would like. There's a continual interplay between those elements. And I think Gramsci understands that in a sensitive way you don't encounter very often, particularly not from, let's say, theorists who themselves have not made their living as political activists. In the case of Gramsci, a real sense that, you know, ultimately politics has to cash out in the form of the remaking of particular humans. And there are dimensions here. I know there's been some important recent work being done on correspondences between Gramsci and Fanon. And I've often reflected when Fanon's talking about decolonization, you know, it really is the replacement of one type of human being by another. You know, the whole discourse around the new man. These elements, I think, are also importantly present in Gramsci, that the process of struggle at those macro levels has implications in quite profound and intricate ways, also at the micro level. And it's precisely the interaction between those dimensions that are the forms in which change occurs concretely in the real historical process. So there's no opposition there. There's necessarily the interchange and exchange between those levels. And it's there as an element, as I said, sometimes in Gramsci explicit, but always, I think, present, even when implicit, as the sort of trajectory along which any political movement needs to move. That a really vibrant political movement, it will transform its participants, and its participants will transform it. So you'll have a continual dialectical, if you want, exchange between those levels.
Thank you. Thank you. I addressed to my fellow Gramscians from Montreal, Timothy, Julien, do you guys have any questions? Otherwise, I guess we can wrap this up. No? Okay.
Yeah, I could make a brief comment here just to bring it back to the organizational framework here, that we invited for our first workshop a labor organizer. And it's when you're speaking now about the context of Gramsci, we kind of see in our present moment like a resurgence of labor organization and labor movements, and at the same time, on the other hand, similar to that, like as a competing historical consciousness or interpretive framework, you have kind of neo-fascism or new authoritarian movements. But an interesting thing that has been a theme throughout our workshops here is sorry, I got a little bit lost in my notes here. But the commonality between the possibility of having a commonality between minoritarian or disparate social movements or social products, social projects. So, I mean, I just wanted to point out that that's a common theme that we've been working on here and has come up through several of the discussions. I think the concept of prefiguration, I think we're also seeing something that's actually, coming into being in new political practices and new cultural and political forms. I think a overall problem that we've been having is actually how that commonality is constituted and how leadership is established, without a totality. Yeah, I think just from some of the things that we've been speaking about here is just the problem of turning of finding a commonality that can be permanent in time and can be institutionalized in some type of concrete form. But I wanted to tie that back, some of the themes of this discussion into our previous workshops and some of the overall themes of this workshop series. But that would be my only comment, to try to synthesize or connect some of the discussion to the workshop series and our project. But if Christina or Roberto, if you have any other closing remarks, I'd like to once again thank the participants and thank Peter Thomas, and invite everybody to follow us or to follow our activities on our webpage. We have the Rethinking Gramsci conference coming up the 8th, 9th, and 10th of May here in Montreal. So please reach out. The link is in the chat. So please please reach out to us, and we look forward to being in touch with you in the future, and to work precisely on on finding concrete forms of some of these projects that we've been talking about here. So, Roberto, so thank you.
Yeah, I guess we can wish everybody a good Friday night, afternoon, depending on the time zone. And hope to see you soon. And thank you again, Peter, for the kind rest. I know that there must be pretty late, so thanks for your availability.
Thanks very much to everybody. Really enjoyed that. It was a great discussion. So best of luck with all the other initiatives.